welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Magic Rules You Might Be Getting Wrong, or what it has more commonly become known as Magic Rules questions from my viewers, which is mostly what I do in these videos now. So let's start out with this one, which appeared on my lands video, talking about underrated lands in the format. In particular, I was talking about Hostile Hostel, one of the most underrated lands in the format, in my opinion. Great include in a lot of black commander decks. That's right, it has to go in a black commander deck. And I actually had this question, wait, why exactly can't Hostile Hostel be in a non-black commander deck? Creeping In doesn't have black mana pips, so it's not identified as a black creature. Or is there something I missed? I thought color identification depended solely on the mana pips. That is correct. You did indeed miss something. And to understand this, we have to go way, way back and look at Dryad Arbor, which I believe was the first card to do this. The card technically doesn't actually have any text on it, right? It's just a forest dryad, and we should know what it does by its creature type or card type, right? It's a land creature. But the original printing from Future Sight says Dryad Arbor is green, because at the time, they didn't have the color indicator, which was created after this. If we look at the updated version from Time Spiral Remastered, you'll see there's this little green dot beside the card type that is called a color indicator. That is the part that you are missing. That's the part that indicates what color this card is if it doesn't have the pips in the mana cost. Yes, you are correct about the mana pips. Any of those pips in that card will identify it as that color, but if it doesn't have any, the color indicator will do so, right? They also did this with the free spells like Pact of Negation. That's very clearly a blue card, and again, if you look at the original printing in Future Sight, it says Pact of Negation is blue, but of course the updated version doesn't have that part of the text. It just has that little blue circle there, right? Beside Instant. That's the color indicator that indicates that that card is indeed blue. If we look at some newer cards like Tetsin Gnome Champion, which of course is a blue, red, and white card on the front, and on the back, when you flip it over, it indeed has that color indicator there that says this is a blue, red, and white card. It has all three colors in that little circle. Now let's go look at Hostile Hostel. Of course, it's a land on the front. There's no color indication of any kind, but of course, in the commander format, the backside of a card, what color that is matters as well. And when we flip over our Hostile Hostel, it indeed has that black circle beside the card type artifact creature, and that indicates that it is indeed a black card. So you can only put it in a commander deck that has black as a color identity. Here's another question from a viewer on next ruling video. Can you explain Rug of Smothering? Also, how that will work with Ob Nixilis Captive Kingpin. Also another ruling on Drannith versus Captive Kingpin as well, because is playing same as casting. I'm new to the game for about a year now and would really like these rulings cleared up for me. Thank you. So the first part I will cover here is playing the same as casting? It is not. Playing a card can mean a couple of different things. It actually encompasses two different things. Mostly you are going to see this on Impulse Draw. So Active Impulse says, exile the top 3 cards of your library until end of turn. You may play those cards. If you cast a spell this way, you still pay its cost. You may play a land this way only if you have an available land play remaining. So that explains exactly what's going on there. When something says play a card, that is including both casting spells and playing lands, because of course those are two separate things. If something says cast, then that only means cast. It doesn't mean playing lands. So for example, we look at Apex of Power. Exile the top 7 cards of your library. Until end of turn, you may cast spells from among them. So you cannot play lands from among those cards. You may only cast spells. So any lands you exile with that are just going to stay in exile. Now let's look at Rug of Smothering, a card that I was completely unfamiliar with until I was asked this question. So 3 mana artifact creature construct 1/3 with flying. Whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 1 life for each spell they've cast this turn. So the explanation for how this card works? Well, whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 1 life for each spell they've cast this turn. So the first time you cast a spell in any turn, that is going to trigger this, because of course this is a triggered ability. Whenever a player casts a spell, so anytime any player in the game at any point is casting a spell, they will lose 1 life. Unless they've cast more spells, right? So for each spell they've cast this turn. So just talking about me, I cast a spell, I trigger this because whenever a player casts a spell, it's exactly what I'm doing. I will lose 1 life for each spell I've cast this turn. Well, I've only cast 1, so I'm going to lose 1 life. Then I cast a second spell. This will trigger again, and it'll say whenever a player casts a spell, they lose 1 life for each spell they've cast this turn. I've now cast 2 spells, right? You have to include the spell that is currently on the stack. As soon as you put a spell on the stack and pay the mana for it, it is now considered to be cast. That's what's triggering this ability in the first place, right? That might be where some of this confusion is coming in. This triggers when a player casts a spell, therefore, of course, it has to be included in the spells you've cast this turn. So if I'm casting my second spell, that spell is currently on the stack, this will trigger, I will lose 2 life, and I will lose the 2 life before that spell actually resolves. So if I'm trying to destroy Rug of Smothering and I have 1 life left, it is unlikely that I will be able to survive that scenario, right? I'll cast my Krosan Grip, targeting the Rug of Smothering. I am now casting a spell that will trigger this, and I will lose 1 life before my Krosan Grip resolves, of course, right? So that part of the interaction is important as well. Now, how does this work with Ob Nixilis? Captive Kingpin? Well, he says whenever one or more opponents each lose exactly 1 life, put a +1/+1 counter on Ob Nixilis. So this card, or commander likely, is looking for your opponents to lose exactly 1 life. My presumption here is that you are going to put Rug of Smothering in your Ob Nixilis deck. Is it a good fit? I would say it's a pretty good fit. Maybe not the best fit ever, but it does work. Of course, the Rug of Smothering hits you as well, but will not trigger your Ob Nixilis because that only looks for opponents losing life. So as I just said, you cast your first spell on a turn. One of your opponents, right, will cast their first spell on their turn. They're going to lose 1 life upon casting that spell, and obviously that is exactly 1 life, and your commander will trigger. That seems pretty darn good. Now, when it happens again, of course, even though this ability says that player loses 1 life, they're not actually losing 1 life when they cast their second spell. They're losing 2 life, and with their third spell, they're losing 3 life. So they are no longer losing exactly 1 life. They're losing more than that. This is not triggering multiple times for each time that spell was cast. It's just triggering once for their second spell they've cast, and as it resolves, they will lose 2 life. So that will not trigger your Ob Nixilis, because of course it's not exactly 1 life. I hope that clarifies that question. A card that originally was an enchantment, then transformed into a creature. Double-faced, is exiled, and then returned to the battlefield at the end of turn. Does it return as a creature or as an enchantment? So this question is fairly easily answered. It applies to all transforming cards. It applies to all MDFC cards as well. If you blink any of them, so you're exiling them and then returning them to play, they will return to play face up. Every card is going to enter the battlefield face up when it's returned to play. If you have a morph creature, right, you have it face down. Really easy way to flip over your morph creatures is with blinking. Talked about this with the new Vannifar from Murders of Karlov Manor. Vannifar evolved Enigma, which at the beginning of combat on your turn, you're going to cloak a card from your hand, which means you're going to put it onto the battlefield face down. And what I said is a really great way to cheat things into play is I just put some giant thing, doesn't even have to be a creature, it can be an omniscience, face down on the battlefield at the beginning of combat on my turn, and then on my end step, that Conjurer's Closet will flicker it, it'll come back into play, and when it does, it will be face up. No casting cost required there. Great way to cheat giant things into play. So that is what will always happen with that interaction. We'll end off with a question from my Discord. We got a rules channel there where people ask questions about particular rules interactions, and somebody was asking about Athreos Shroud Veiled. So 4 white, black, legendary enchantment creature, god, indestructible. As long as your devotion to white and black is less than 7, Athreos isn't a creature. At the beginning of your end step, put a coin counter on another target creature. Whenever a creature creature with a coin counter on it dies or is put into exile, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So the question is, what happens with the coin counters if this card gets removed? So let's say I have an Athreos Shroud Veil deck. I put a bunch of coin counters on a bunch of creatures. Let's say there's 3 or 4 creatures in play, mine or my opponent's, that have coin counters on them. Then my commander gets exiled. I put it back in the command zone and somebody casts a board wipe. What happens? Well, let's ask ourselves, what does a coin counter do? At the beginning of your end step, put a coin counter on another target creature. Okay, well, what does it do? It doesn't say what it does, right? Doesn't actually say what the coin counter is. If the card doesn't give a description of what the counter does, then it's just a meaningless counter that doesn't actually do anything. However, the counter does do something, but it only does something because of the ability that this card has whenever a creature with a coin counter on it dies. That is no different than a card that would say whenever a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, right? If that card's not on the battlefield, doesn't do anything. If a creature with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, just dies like it normally would. The same is true for Athreos. If your Athreos isn't on the battlefield, then that ability does not apply. Any creature with coin counters on them, if they die or get exiled, they'll just die or get exiled like they normally would. They are not going to return to the battlefield under your control because that ability is not active, because this card is not actually on the battlefield. Now, conversely, let's look at Mathis Fiendseeker. At the beginning of your end step, put a bounty counter on target creature and opponent controls. For as long as that creature has a bounty counter on it, it has, in quotations, when this creature dies, each opponent draws a card and gains 2 life. So this is a completely different scenario. This is a case where this card is telling us exactly what that counter does. And those quotations are always really, really important. Whenever you see quotations like that with an ability, it essentially means you're stamping those words actually on the card. So when you put one of these bounty counters on a creature, this ability is saying as long as that creature has a bounty counter on it, it has essentially those words printed on the card, right? Everything you see in quotations there, when this creature dies, each opponent draws a card and gains 2 life. Those words are essentially printed on whatever creature that is for as long as that bounty counter remains on there, but not when your commander remains on the battlefield. That is not part of the agreement here, right? What this card says is as long as there's a bounty counter on it, it doesn't matter if your commander's on the battlefield. So if your commander dies, now it's in the command zone and someone cast a board wipe, yes, you will still get the effect from all those bounty counters on all those creatures because they have that wording essentially printed on them, right? So very much a different aspect there. If counters are placed on things that imbue a specific ability, then fine. But if they're not, if they're just a placeholder that is referring to another card, well, if that other card's not in play, then it's not really doing anything, right? Of course, that is very important to note. That is it. That is all. Some more Magic Rules interactions that you might be confused about. If you have any confusion or interesting questions of your own, let me know in the comments below and I might tackle it in the next Magic Rules video. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.